Hi everyone, my name is Shundeng, and I'm going to be giving a series of three lectures that are important to research, relevant to research, to relevant to contemporary research. But um, this is the lectures that I give form the non-statistical components of this course. So I hope you are able to take a break from statistics and kind of enjoy the other um, facets around research. But these facets are really important, no less important than the statistical concepts that you're learning. And these are things that you will need to bring with yourselves to when you go out to the field, when you start your research career, when you start gaining some research experience. So the first in the series is on ethical challenges in contemporary research, or simply just research ethics. So we start with kind of describing ethics or trying to understand a little bit about what ethics are. So ethics basically are guidelines for decision making, and these guidelines are formed by social norms, and so they can be very nuanced. They are extremely variable around the world. Different types of behavior can be viewed as ethical or not in different societies, and different professions will therefore have different guidelines to help researchers navigate ethical dilemmas. The guidelines for social researchers can be very different from ecological researchers or from medical researchers, for example. We are going to split this lecture into two parts. The first part is on field ethics, you going out collecting data, and what you need to know and keep in mind as you are going about your data collection. The second part is on the post-analysis period where you are disseminating information. Once you've done your research, you still have to write it up. After you write it up, you have to disseminate it. Quite often, part of this ethical dissemination, if you are like me, you work in areas that are developing, or if you work in rural or very interior areas, like for me, I work in the interior of Borneo. It is very important and it's often a legal requirement that you return to your field site, or to at least to the country of your field site, and disseminate the information, and disseminate your findings. So how do we do this in the correct way, in an ethical way, will be discussed in part two. So field ethics. The first thing and the most important thing that people um, sort of keep at the back of their mind, but they don't really think about it, is this thing called positionality. So positionality is your position in relation to this your study subjects. So when we say in relation, there can be different contextual locations. So it could be in the social setting, it could be in a political setting. And when we talk about positionality, what it actually is made up of pretty much are your identity markers. What makes me me, what makes you you, and what makes my study subjects out there them. So it could be things like ethnicity, they could be gender, they could be the origin of their birth, education levels, social economic statuses, their values, their beliefs. And when you enter a field site, or when I enter the field site, there is this period of us and them kind of sizing each other, observing each other, like the pheasants here, courtship ritual thing, to kind of come up with a heuristic picture of where you are in relation to them. So, how accurate this picture in this mental picture in a person's mind is, there are certain barriers to forming this accurate picture. So things like cultural language barriers. And if you have these sort of barriers, it forms a little box around the person because you can't break through to them. It's very hard to build rapport. And anytime you enter an indigenous, very interior type of community where you're not their type of person, you're not from there. There's always this guardedness. So they tend to reply to things that they think you want to know, or they are trying to figure out what you want to get out of them. So researchers often go in being perceived as, and often really are, there to take. So just recapping the concept of positionality. So the positionality is the position of the researcher in relation to the subject. So it is the who of the researcher. It is made up also of the who of your subjects. And it is how the subjects and the researchers perceive each other. The outcome of your research is based a lot more about the perception of your subjects to you than the researcher, than your own perception of the respondents. Which is why I have that line in much smaller font, because it is a much smaller factor. So can we kind of measure positionality? We can. So there's this closeness affinity scale. If you are fresh from the outside, you look completely different, you sound completely different, you've never been there before, you will be considered the external outsider, and you're very distant. You can be completely shut out of the community. Your project could be over even before it started. Once you've been there a while, you build some rapport. People are inviting you to come over to their parties, or you go to their homes for tea, and that's when you get a little bit into the community. But you are still not one of them, but you are a friend to them. So that's when you become an external insider. For a lot of researchers, external insider is as far as they are going to get. Because simply because you've never been one of them. Your origins are not from there. But there are some communities, like the community that I lived with in Borneo, you can be adopted into a family. Where you become sort of part of them. You've already learned the language. You've been with the community for a many number of years. You've done good things to help the community. So you sort of are not really indigenous, but you're not really external as well. So there's this gray range that exists here, which I think I am, which you are sort of not really indigenous, not really external, but you are already an insider. Then past that point is the kind of the indigenous zone. So indigenous insiders are people who are from a certain community. They could be an elder, they could be a very learned, a very respected person who is doing research in his or her own community. Then this person will be considered an indigenous insider. Someone who is from around but not quite from the actual spot, then will often be considered an indigenous outsider. So either way, you can see that there's sort of a split where you are one side is the part of the community, and the other side that's on the far end is completely not from there. As researchers, the best we can aim for is to, as researchers like me who are from outside going in, the best we can aim for is to be somewhere exactly in the middle. But that takes time. So when we talk about positionality, we talk about markers. And these are our identity markers. That's the first point is me. I'm male. I'm ethnic Chinese. My origin is from Singapore. I have a PhD and I am a researcher interested in the perception of electrification projects in the deep interior of Borneo. The next point gives you a bit of a background as to why I'm interested in this. Um, my perception of them is that, based on what I read previously or what I knew, is that I know that they were displaced by hydropower development. And they used to live off ancestral lands, and they lived along a really long river, where they could hunt, they could fish for subsistence. They now have to be moved to a resettlement area quite far, and they have to learn to use cash, to use money. So they are trying to learn to reconstruct livelihoods and buy food, and rely less on hunting or fishing. When you get to these communities, you find that a lot of times the men have all left, because they need to find cash. So they have left for work in logging camps to leave behind the women, children, and the elderly. When you are allowed into a community to do research, you don't just go in. You, as researchers, we don't just waltz in and collect data and leave. You have to be given permission to go in. There are different levels of permission. So there is the legislative level, so the legal level, where you apply for your permits, you get your research guidelines, and you are allowed in. But that's only one level. The second level is where you need to have social permission to get in. So the community that you're living with, the community that you're going to study, needs to give you access as well. So the government piece of paper doesn't really mean very much to a lot of remote communities, because you don't have the social permission. And when as if we are given access, we're actually allowed into this very private parts, very private worlds of the subjects. So this access is a privilege, because it puts subjects in very vulnerable positions. And I will explain why in the next few slides. So remember, when I say that the data collection is influenced by the subject's perception of me. This social norm matching or mismatching. They have their own intentions, they have their own expectations. And there is a perceived power relation from them towards me. So remember, I had an earlier slide where I had my perceptions of them before I entered the field site. Once I enter the field site, they begin to form the perceptions of me using my identity markers. So the first one is I come from a rich country. Singapore used to be a part of the Malaysian Federation, as is the state of my field study, which is the East Malaysian state of Sarawak. The background of Sarawak is that it is an oil and gas rich state, and there is always an undercurrent in the society that the state could have broken away, like Singapore, and have gotten rich from the oil and gas reserves it has itself. So there's always this class difference perceived among themselves within the interior communities, that there is a class difference. There's at least a class difference between Singaporeans and Sarawakians, native Sarawakians. The second identity marker that they really cotton on to is my Australian association via the ANU. So they they are familiar with Australia. In fact, a lot of political leaders are educated in Australia, were educated in Australia. The leader of the dominant political party at the time in in Sarawak, was an ANU PhD. The Australian companies had a very big role to play in the dam that displaced them. It was the Colombo Plan that first suggested the construction of the dam in the 1960s, and it was Noe Hydro that led the project. Um, Australian missionaries had gone deep into the interior many decades ago to introduce Christianity, and they actually brought a small number of children from the interior to come to Australia to be educated. Um, and also, they remembered my PhD supervisor who was actually there, living there for 30 years before they were resettled. So they considered her more insider than me. As I was new, I had not been adopted into any family yet. I couldn't speak the language, and had no family. Therefore, I wasn't like a part of them yet. And interestingly enough, they're really they're really interested in the idea of the PhD because I think a lot of them have some concept of university education. A few of them do have university education, and they kind of know that the PhD is kind of the highest level that normally people would be able to attain. So there are differences in terms of country status. There are differences in terms of coming from a country of power. So they view Australia as a country of power, and this is going to be a topic for another day. But this is why countries project or exert soft power. There's also this class difference in terms of the kind of connections that I could make. And this form the initial perceptions of me. So when you see this set of perceptions that they would have made from me, the first thing that would have come to their mind is, what does this guy want? Why am I there? What would I want from them, and would I get them in trouble? So why people think like that is because the researchers, we often have the power skewed in our favor. And in order to protect them, to protect us, and to do the right thing, basically, there are a few things that you need to build into your own research. The first thing to do is to run a risk assessment. So the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research identifies a risk as involving the likelihood that harm will occur and the severity of the harm, including its consequences. So these two are not directly related. You could have something that is likely to happen but not severe, or you could be something that's not likely to happen but very severe. So, for example, if I have to go deep into the interior, I have to go into the lake and take an 8-hour boat ride. The boat's run by a 40 horsepower engine, but it has no cover. They call it a longboat, and it is as only 1 man wide and about 3 or 4 meters long. 8 hours on that. What's the risk? The risk of someone falling out of the boat generally is quite low because they're quite skilled boatmen. But if something if something like this did happen, severity would be very high. Because of the depth of the lake, it's very murky. Someone could get cut by the the propeller of the boat engine going past. So this is an example of a low likelihood and but high severity event. What's if you go into as you walk through the bush to get to a community, there's a very high likelihood that you're going to get cuts, scratches, because the terrain of the area is very very steep, and in that terrain in that part of the world where it's very steep, you are likely to get type of plant called rattan. So it's a kind of a small palm, and it's got spines that are this long. It's impossible to walk past without getting scratches or cuts at some point. The likelihood of this happening is very very high. But it's not severe. It's just you just walk it off. You just walk it off, wash it up. It's like a scratch. So when you run through these risk assessments, you run through the scenarios in your head, and you identify what could go wrong, and then you gauge the likelihood of the risk, gauge the severity. And in a lot of risk assessments and risk assessment matrix, you are required to design methods to minimize the risk or eliminate, if possible. Once that's all done, look at it again. Do the benefits outweigh the remaining risk? If yes, how do you manage them? When we work with risk, I have almost never come to a point where risk can be completely eliminated. So that's something that we constantly have to manage. We have to adapt to the situation at the field site. The other thing that I should also mention that I didn't put down in the slide is that when I started my PhD fieldwork, my supervisor at the time, Professor Colin Groves, told me the first rule of fieldwork is that everything will change in the field. So the risk assessment that you take to the field, be prepared to change the risk assessments once you get to the field and you actually get real experience in that field site. Because it's very hard to imagine what could go wrong unless you are there. So when you work with people and you work in vulnerable communities, or any community, in fact, you need to ensure that participation in your program is voluntary, and you need to get informed consent. So there's two parts to this, of course. One is voluntary, the other side is informed consent. Voluntary means that there is no external pressure to participate. Nobody forces them to participate. They participate on their own willingly. The second thing is that they must be allowed to withdraw at any time. They don't have to give you a reason why they are withdrawing, and there is no consequence. So when I say no consequence, this is one of the examples. In a lot of communities in Southeast Asia, when you want to do any research there, part of the process of building up rapport is that you bring food. You bring like cases of turmeric noodles, canned supplies, as a part of your introduction to the area, where you introduce your project, what you want to do, and the questions that will come in the slide in the following slides. But a part of it is this sort of gift package. They can withdraw, and they should be allowed to withdraw without suffering the penalty of not um, having the time any time compensated by the food packages that you already brought. So you cannot say that you didn't finish. You cannot take any of this with you. That's not possible. So informed consent means that you provide your subjects with full information. Who is doing the research? What is the research for? Who is funding it? If you carry on with this research or you come with us, what are the risks um, that you could get yourself exposed to? And this informed consent must be presented in understandable language. If you come from a place like me, where it is not your first language, you need to get a translator to come with you. In fact, in a lot of countries, external researchers are required to bring a government officer with them when they're conducting research. And then, of course, there needs to be a feedback or complaint process. So the contact of a superior, the contact of a department must be made available. Again, if you give a part of the informed consent is to tell them you have the right to withdraw. And this informed consent can be given as a sheet of a written sheet where they read, or in communities where literacy is low, they can be verbal. But for people who work in urban communities and you fill out this online surveys, once you start filling out the survey, it is considered that the consent is given. So it's all good to say that, to tell communities that your subjects that you can withdraw at any time, you can withdraw at any time. The problem is that because the power dynamics are skewed in your favor, you're seen as at a higher level to them. First of all, they may not believe that there's this free lunch that you could just withdraw and get the goodies and run off. The second thing is that they may be afraid to withdraw because you are you. There's difference. Children also will carry on, or we know that children tend to carry on with an uncomfortable survey if they're given by an authoritative adult. So when you involve children, you need to also include their authoritative adult, which tends to be the parents, grandparents, people who can read the signs that this child is uncomfortable. And we need to excuse the child. And also there is no excuse if, for example, at some point you receive your department receives a complaint that they haven't been allowed to excuse themselves, and the researcher says, no one said that. The failure of the researcher to read the science is not an excuse for. It's basically not an excuse. The active consent, yes, and failure to dissent, the inability to say no, they're not the same. Failure to dissent is not consent. We also need to protect participant rights. So if you work in places, especially in places where there are political sensitivities, this becomes very important. So when you write up your research, or when you take your notes, participants cannot be identified. Cannot be identified, especially when you quote them. You may make small notes, but these notes or these initials that you give to the participants, you should try as far as possible not to make them identifiable. They make them linked to a certain characteristic of a person, unless they ask for the names to be revealed. Sometimes when you interview a person regarding a certain event, they get so emotionally charged that then they can scream at the top of their voice, at the time from emotion that you can say that you can say that this is from me. I don't care. I don't care about the risks. You include it with full risk disclosure, and then you come back to it again repeatedly to make sure that when this person has had a few days to calm down, that they are still willing to take on this risk. And even then, even if they ask for their names to be revealed, you will have to run an internal risk assessment yourself as to whether or not this this request is worth fulfilling. Participants should not ever be identified for a third party due to political risk and stigma. So, probably less relevant for people who kind of do their research around Australia, I think. But for many of you who maybe if you get interested in, like me, in political ecology, or in tropical ecology, you end up in places where to get into the field site, you will need to make political connections. But this political benefits work both ways. So sometimes your political connection could ask you for a favor to identify someone. And this did really happen to me. So you have to really tactfully, diplomatically find a way to decline. So your ethics, your field behavior, of course, will have to be guided by laws. Laws and guidelines vary from country to country. Stick with the lowest common denominator. When you get permission to go overseas to do your research, this is something that your host government might give to you. This is something from Malaysia. This is the permission. Is an appendix, kind of a warning to the researcher on what not to do, or you might get kicked out of the country. So you try and keep within these boundaries. As much as possible. Sometimes they can be really, really restrictive to the point that you would have to completely change your project. So these are risks to your own project that you have to take into consideration. So there's this list, and it's in chapter 4 of the Ethics of Social Research. It's worth reading, worth going through. I'm not going to go line by line, but if ever some of you do get into research and you are required to do ethical and risk assessment, it will be worth looking at this chapter, pull out the questions, and really go through with them. And then constantly revise them. Remember, and this is the sage advice that I would recommend that everyone carry with them the rest of their life. Once you get into the field, everything will change. So the ethical considerations and the risk assessments that you make before you go to the field is very, very likely to change once you get to the field. So revise constantly. So we come to the second part of contemporary research ethics, which is that after you've done your data collection, you've done all your fancy statistics stuff, it's time to write up and disseminate your information and disseminate your findings. So this when we try and disseminate information, we have to be careful of falling into the interest trap. When we're trying to write something, I'm trying to write, or even as a part of analysis. Um, as people publishing the results or people writing up the results, we have to keep a very clear mind of the biases that we have. Keep a very clear mind about not trying to draw conclusions that should not be there. So there's this example, um, which was quite big for a very short time, a number of years ago. It was picked up by the major news articles on news channels worldwide from a piece of Australian research that pawns apparently or spurs are growing out of the back of young people's skulls, and apparently the use of um, mobile phones are to blame. So you can see that this little uh, protrusion from the end of the bottom of the skull of a young person apparently is more substantial and more prevalent among young people than older aged people. The people who looked this up, who discovered this, I think they were occupational therapists or something along that kind of professions. So they found like a 2 centimeter long, 2.5 centimeter long spurs in certain skull scans, and there is a 3 millimeter difference between the younger ones and the older ones, and the older ones have they're a little bit longer in the younger people ones. And so they jump to the conclusion that it must be caused by phone use because young people use their phones. But actually, this is not the case. Any uh, human archaeologists or bioanthropologists will tell you that in this spur at the back of the head, at the bottom of the back of the head, it's actually quite common in male primates. The reason being that the male primate head is heavier, and because it's heavier, the muscle attachment tends to be required to be a bit stronger, and that's also why in a lot of non-human primates you find this sagittal crest, this long ridge of bone that runs around the back of it, and that spur is actually the end of it. It is to hold the greater amount of mass or the weight of muscles holding the head up. You can see this very clearly in gorillas. So if you look at female gorillas, the head is like round, and male gorillas tend to have this large crest, and this is where all the muscles are, and there's this sagittal crest that runs down and ends in the back. So first of all, by not consulting other disciplines, they made a huge mistake. But what's interesting, you should look at is also look at the authors. It's always good practice to look at the authors, look at whether this field that they are publishing is their field. Because in this case, we found that it was then later on, a lot of people wrote articles to debunk this article and the premise of this article, the thesis of this article. And then it turns out that these were people trying to sell orthopedic pillows for when for people to lie down to sleep in. So there's a vested interest in publishing this article. So when somehow they stumbled upon X-rays like this, I think it excited them so much that they didn't bother to look for reasons in other fields. They just jumped to the conclusion that it must be from mobile phone use. So there's this quote that says that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a ball. Everything looks like a nail, and so they're trying to sell pillows that improve head and neck performance. Um, Once they found something that simply means it looks like an anomaly, they just jumped on it. So, um, ethical publishing and ethical dissemination is very highly linked to the way that you do your uh, your research analysis, your data analysis, and how you write up how you present the analysis. Because by the time you come to this analysis and writing part, um, for the researcher, a lot of time, effort, sweat has already been put in. It's not just about going out to collect the data. It's not just about running the statistics. It is the time to plan, the lead time to plan, the time to get research permission, the time taken to get the risk and ethics clearance, the cost of going to the field, the cost and time spent away from home, uh, and these costs generally build up. They could be very expensive time wise. They could be very expensive in terms of finances, and it could be very expensive in terms of mentally. Um, so once researchers become aware of hyper aware of the investments they had put in of the various types of investment they put in, they become very vulnerable to biases and fallacies. These are often unintentional, but definitely very preventable. And everyone will have to conduct their own due diligence. It does not mean that anyone who is highly experienced um, will be able to avoid this. Not, I think everyone's human, so we can see that in this case, science retracts the paper of a Nobel laureate because they can't reproduce the results. Um, Reproducibility is one of the ways that helps us to avoid problems in our research and problems in our dissemination. So because researchers spend a lot of time, have or invested a lot of time and emotion into the projects, they tend to anyway because really big projects take such a long time. They involve a lot of people. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of money. And this whole mental and emotional investment exposes anyone, even Nobel laureates, to biases and fallacies, which means that they cannot reproduce their results. It's a one-off. It could look significant, but it is not reproducible. If it is not reproducible, then it is not good science, and it should never be published. We don't say that. We don't think that people tend to do this intentionally. They often don't. But if you do your due diligence, if something really sticks out and it's like something you think is too good to be true, it is too good to be true. So when we say that um, publishing is dissemination is vulnerable to certain types of policies. One of these is called the post hoc policy. Um, the post hoc policy is something that you can kind of see quite commonly, and it's quite common in public health messages or issues in public health. So the most common one, probably the most commonly heard one, is flu vaccines give you the flu. It originates in when people who have taken flu vaccine and then they subsequently fall ill with flu-like symptoms. Uh, so this is an issue with kind of the timing and coincidence. So when the flu vaccine is given, it could coincide with illnesses that come from other sources. Could be hay fever, could be other types of colds that are not part of the flu vaccine cocktail. So when this happens, people tend to associate very closely timed events together, and that's why they jump to the conclusions that flu vaccines give the flu. So when two events happen very close together, and the conclusion that is drawn that one causes another without a clear mechanism of explaining the link, that is post hoc fallacy. So this can happen in research when events come close together, and researchers jump to that conclusion. The other one that's also really, really common is confirmation bias. Anyone, when you design an experiment, you already have a hypothesis in mind, and you have an idea of what you want the project to turn out like. And if something happens to your research that makes it look like the results that you want to see has appeared, people tend not to scrutinize. And this happened to Daniel Wolnick. He's also a Nobel laureate, I think. And he quickly retracted this paper once this error was found, and he found that and when his colleague could not replicate his work, and this was how it was found. His colleague could not replicate his work. He found a single R code mistake, and he was good enough to actually have a chat with Retraction Watch, sort of to reflect on himself. And he's a good read. I recommend also anyone, if you are interested and if you have time to look through his website that's called Retraction Watch. So they keep track of researchers or papers with that are not reproducible, with questionable research methods, and when they get withdrawn, they announce it. They help to announce it and they help to spread it. So there are other biases as well. They are kind of linked to confirmation bias. So the most common one is to cherry pick, like to find evidence to support your hypothesis. Remember that when we do hypothesis testing, we are looking to reject the hypothesis. We never accept the hypothesis. So to collect evidence to support the hypothesis is to try to accept the hypothesis, which we will never want to do. The Texas sharpshooter policy is when people go out wanting to see patterns, which you find a lot in when people have this scatter plot and they look at there's a cluster here and then there's a cluster there and this is very different. But I mean, to anyone who is um, statistically trained but not as invested, they could pretty very well look like very random patterns with no clear clustering at all. Um, and the last one, the just so storytelling bias is a really interesting one because this I find that this is a problem with ecologists and evolutionary biologists, uh, even at the highest level. So when someone goes out to look at a specimen and if you see if some people will look at um, vestigial features or vestigial structures or some unique structure, unique organ, any part or a trait of an organism, um, they tend to ask what the function of a trait is. Um, I think that is the wrong question to ask because they are non-adaptive. They could be non-adaptive, so it might not serve any function. So basically, if there's a trait that doesn't kill the animal before breeding age, um, it tends to hang around. It tends to stay on. So instead of asking whether or what the function of a trait is, you should ask whether a trait has a function. Um, this this is actually better explained in the link the second link in the slide, the logical research questions, and the author wrote this article when I think she really got frustrated at the way that biologists are asking questions because we are out to looking uh, for stories where there could be none. Uh, and when people do that, there's a tendency to end up inventing stories. So we end up speculating. And when people speculate, they tend to write it down. Then as it passes along, it could end up being accepted as truth when it shouldn't be. Again, I have to reiterate that I don't think people tend to want to uh, produce misleading results, but you know the stake that the stake in the outcome, the investment that they put in, often leads people to make mistakes or to ignore mistakes. So this brings us to the next fallacy, which is the sunk cost fallacy. Sunk cost fallacy is quite clear. I think many people also know about this. The more you put in, the more you want a good result, and you keep chasing losses. There's a kind of an interesting article in Nature that looks at the likelihood that scientists engage in not suboptimal behavior. And these are that's the list of the behaviors compared between mid-career researchers and early career researchers. And you find that early career researchers tend to be quite by the book. They're still fresh. Not putting very much to lose. But mid-career researchers, especially those on the cusp of tenure or the full professorship, then there becomes a statistically significant difference in their behaviors. And that mid-career researchers are more likely to, go around the rules, bend a few rules, do with have some inappropriate research behavior. Um, sometimes it's some of it is deliberately doing things. Some sometimes it's going around stuff. Sometimes it's just omitting information. So these are, when you get to a point, or when they get to a point to a career that they are just right there at the last step, and this is when the risk increases because of all the years of putting into the career, when they are they're almost there. Um, so when we talk about publishing, I think everyone, you should be, even if you are in the first year, first semester, you should know by now. There are a lot of people talk about this publish or perish culture in academia. Um, you need to publish. When I was an undergraduate, I started undergraduate studies in 2004. Um, I was told about this publish or perish culture, and then once people got caught on to being able to publish quickly and large volumes, um, then the bar raised a little bit. You have to publish well, so you don't just publish in any random journal. You need to publish firstly in index journals. First came index journals, and then came the stratification of journals. We had the tier one journals, tier two journals, and then so on. So you try to get as many tier one journals as possible. So it became from publish or perish. It became publish well or perish. And then came funding crunches all around the world in academia. So we had to publish well in order to get a big grant, or we'd still perish. In other words, we have to keep publishing. So there's this the pressure to publish leads to mistakes. The volume that are required of many institutions around the world to maintain employment or to maintain funding, this places enormous pressures on principal investigators. So, and this is a review of biomedical and life science research that have been retracted. Found that actually only a small amount of retractions are attributable to just pure mistakes, just pure human error. In fact, they found that they determined that the rest of the retractions were due to misconduct, some kind of misconduct. It could be fraud or suspected fraud. Duplicate publication, which means that you publish in one place and then you take the same publication and then you put it out in somewhere else. Which means that your publication list grows by another one. Or fraud, or or plagiarism. So although I feel that people don't intentionally go out to do these things, researchers don't intentionally go out to do these things, keeping in mind there are pressures, there are constant pressures in academia around the world. This is not to excuse this conduct, but the environment around publishing, the environment around turning publishing into survival is not the best environment. It's not the best working environment for anyone. So when we talk about publishing, I like to kind of think of talk about the process to get published. Uh, when when I was when I was an undergrad, our university actually annually got editors from Science and Nature to give annual workshops to researchers on how to get published in Science and how to get published in Nature. And this was the pressure that was um, in my uni at the time. Um, but to be fair, these editors were very frank, and they always say that Science and Nature receive many manuscripts a year, and the best way to get published is to have a good title, be on trend, and if you think that you have something really interesting, personally call the editor. And I don't these are behaviors that I don't think many people will agree with, because it means that it is no longer a fair review process. Of course, other people could use other unethical tactics like plagiarism or fraud. But actually, if you look at Science and Nature articles, if anyone among you have time, a look at the citations among Science and Nature articles. Very seldom that they have very high citations. Look in any prominent researchers anywhere, look at their publication list. Quite often they will have a citation number attached to them, and Science and Nature papers tend not to be very well cited. Partly because they are in a bit of a magazine format, and we often have to slash word counts to very little. So the idea of the project is there, the idea of the conclusion is there, but they may not always have the best in terms of methodology and the full amount of detail for someone to reproduce a project. So, for example, this is my own publication list. I highlight the two up here. That's so post Fukushima Japan and denuclearization. These two articles were written almost at the exact same time. In fact, I wrote this one first, the one in Science, denuclearization's indirect consequences. This went straight to Nature, and it was a gamble. Just thinking, and this was right after the Fukushima accident, so jumped on it, quickly wrote it up, sent it in, and because it was on trend, Science took it. And then we had time after the first publication, to sit down, think about it, flesh it out, work through the entire research process. We came up with the second article, which is post Fukushima Japan, the continuing nuclear controversy. So we looked at nuclear energy in Japan, the corporate culture in Japan, and the processes or the failures in corporate processes that could have led to the Fukushima meltdown. Much better fleshed out paper, much longer paper, and obviously although it was published 2 years after the Science article, you could see that our colleagues, our counterparts around the world, obviously felt that this, which is a very niche energy journal, energy policy journal, with not a very high impact factor, was a far more useful paper than this rushed, high impact journal job that we did. The other thing that a lot of, as a part of ethical research, is that we need to be mentally prepared for rejections. Okay, so uh, I have never, if you look at that list of publications, none of those papers were ever accepted at the first submission. They always had to come back for revisions. They were rejected, and I had to rewrite or improve, and then send to a different journal. Uh, so the inability to accept rejection comes back to the sunk cost policy. So much has been talked about with the cost associated with publishing, the cost associated with research, the time, the money, the emotions, and they need to publish it desperately, quickly, to move on to the next big thing. And so when there's this need for things to move very quickly, the market will fulfill it. If there's a need, the market will come. And this need for the less ethical is fulfilled by predatory journals. Predatory journals are pay to publish. They don't really have a peer review. They claim to have, but they don't. They're often open access. Anyone can access the articles, which they say that it means that there will be a wide readership, high level of citations. They often solicit publications via spam email, so we get it in our ANU email all the time. You probably do. And anyone can be appointed an editor or a reviewer, including a dog. But rejections, remember, when a reviewer rejects a paper, they are often required to include reasons why. So the rejections can be helpful. If they're nasty, some people are really nasty, so they can be undeserved. But sometimes they are, like, if you submit to Nature, they will reject. The reviews will be helpful. It could be undeserved, but because of the volume of manuscripts that Nature gets, you just have to. Someone will just have to lose out. So this is a rejection letter written by Nature to then Dr. Peter Ratcliffe, and his research on the genetic chain responses. Genetic responses to hypoxia it's a really important field now in cancer research and in things like anemia, where there's a lack of oxygen to cells. But in 1992, it wasn't hot enough. It wasn't a big enough field. So Nature thought that the work wasn't of sufficient quality or sufficient interest to Nature. That was in 1992. But he stuck on with it. And by 2019, he was Sir Peter Ratcliffe, and he won a Nobel Prize for this exact same piece of research that was rejected by Nature. So the point I'm trying to make is the worth of your research is not determined by a rejection letter. Then the worth of your research is determined by how it is used, or how important that the greater research community thinks of it. Which is kind of similar to when I talked about the when I compared my two papers earlier. The next part on the ethical publishing or ethical dissemination is if you look at the author lists at the top. When you download the paper, and then there's a title, and then you get the list of authors. How do you, if there's more than two, how do you distribute them? The most common way is by relative distribution. It's the most common way. So the people who contribute the most at the front, people who work on it physically on it the least is at the back. So usually uh, the very senior um, lab leaders, where people who have like 15 PhD students and 16 postdocs, you know, 70 projects going on at one time. They just supervise. They tend to be at the back. First authors usually are the people who uh, the people at front, and the names at the front generally contribute the most. In huge projects, in multinational projects, large collaborations involving 200 people, 300 people, then these names will be alphabetical. Um, Sometimes there is a little asterisk that says that everyone is considered a first author because everyone contributed equally. Then there will be this one. Usually, you have to leave a note there. But this is almost never seen. I've only ever seen it once in my career. So fairness and and this equity among co-authors is actually uh, something that is surprisingly important to a lot of people. Um, I think because the way that the order of things are negotiated and how people perceive the, the name in a citation. So the most important is to always be the first author, simply because it's the most prominent position. It's always first author et al. Nobody remembers et al. Everyone remembers the name of the first author. Last author is always the supervisor, so that's the guru and the sagely role at the back. So there's a high level of respectability there. And then the middle names tend to be negotiated among the middle authors. The result of lab academic politics is often that. Often it's a requirement of research permits that you let the government officer who's not done anything to be in there. So there are a few things to negotiate around the apart from the first and the last, the order of contribution in the middle. So I'm moving past publication, the actual act of publication, and talking about fairness and equity in academia a little bit. So we have known for a long time that academia and research careers have a gender and diversity problem. And when this and this results in kind of a high level of unconscious bias in terms of decision making, just not just within the research itself, but also in institutions that are research intensive, like universities. So if you just do a quick Google and you look up professor, it's highly likely that you get your image search will look like that. You can see that the general AI learned um, AI learned perception of a male professor is a certain kind of a professor is a certain kind of person. But interestingly, if you use the search word um, teacher, it becomes far more diverse. Certainly a lot more female than the first than using the search term professor. Um, this this paper also this paper reviews the just in general the people who publish in Australia's top journals, the academics, the legal academics that publish who publish in Australia's top law journals, and found that there's only one woman at the top. Um, and it's not just in the legal circles, in um, ecology and ecology and evolution and behavioral ecology, these two different journals. They find that if they double blind, um, if they double blind the reviewers, that means the reviewers did not know who the authors were. They receive the paper, they read it, they grade it on its own merit, and recommend it for publication. If they didn't know who the authors were, they didn't have the author list, the number of female first authored articles jump, and the number of male first authored articles may drop. So there's this balancing, rebalancing when double blind comes in. So when we talk about diversity, I think there's also we should also not forget about the inclusion of diversity other than gender, so race, religion, and so on. Um, the first thing is that the universities and academia should be the example of equity, which we are not. And I think this is something that is very important that we need to fix, and we need to have, like all other occupations that they are working towards equal or fair representation. Academia in particular should work a lot harder. A lack of representation, not just it being unjust and unfair, and also if you want to think about it in a utilitarian way, it also results in a real lack of diversity of ideas, real lack of diversity of solutions, because without this diversity of representation, there's a very narrow range of experiences, life experiences, and cultural experiences, and it makes our institutions and it makes academia all the much poorer for it. So thank you everyone for sitting through this first quite heavy ethical session, this session on research ethics. The other two that will come up will be much lighter, and I hope that you will learn a lot more. You have learned a lot through this lecture. Thank you.